I reported to work before most people had poured their first cup of coffee. I didn't need recognition or applause. The systems I built were my validation. They were silent, efficient, and invisible, the kind of infrastructure that only matters when it fails. My fingerprints lived in every automated process, every database that reconciled thousands of transactions overnight, every vendor module that synced deliveries across multiple time zones. Directors took credit for expansion strategies, executives bragged about growth curves, and HR celebrated retention metrics. But none of it existed without the code quietly pulsing across servers I had nurtured for nearly 2 decades. I was the constant in a company that believed constants didn't require attention. On a cold Monday morning, that illusion evaporated. I was summoned to HR without context, no agenda, no forewarning, just a sterile message from a department that rarely contacted me. The walk from my office to their wing was unusually quiet. Conversations hushed as I passed. It was the kind of silence that suggests decisions have already been made. I stepped into a small conference room where 3 people waited, the HR manager, a supervisor I barely recognized, and a young man no older than my first internship. His suit was too new, the kind bought for occasions rather than careers. He smiled with the confidence of someone who had never watched a system fail under real pressure. HR introduced him as my transition partner, a phrase designed to sound collaborative while hiding its intent. The moment the word transition left her mouth, the temperature in the room shifted. My instincts didn't need clarification. I wasn't preparing a successor. I was preparing an exit. The young man shook my hand with enthusiasm. He spoke about how excited he was to learn, how honored he felt to shadow me, and how he looked forward to contributing to the modernization of legacy systems. Legacy systems. They loved using that phrase like history was something to be ashamed of rather than something that had kept the building standing. He didn't realize the so-called legacy wasn't outdated code. It was the experience that prevented outages, fraud, payroll disasters, and million-dollar vendor penalties. As he spoke, HR slid printed documents across the table. They were labeled Knowledge Transfer Plan, complete with deadlines, milestones, and performance expectations. Everything about the plan assumed compliance. There was no invitation for dialogue, no acknowledgement of 17 years of loyalty, and no explanation for why my role suddenly needed a mirrored version. In that moment, I understood the cruel brilliance of corporate language. It doesn't fire you. It replaces you and waits for you to notice. I scanned the plan. 6 weeks. 6 weeks to internalize 17 years of decisions, optimizations, and contingencies. 6 weeks to transform instinct into bullet points. 6 weeks to train someone whose technical foundation rested not on understanding systems, but on believing documentation replaces comprehension. My supervisors sat quietly, their silence confirming complicity. Decisions had already been made. I was no longer part of the future. They were merely extracting the past. I didn't argue. People who argue at that stage misunderstand the battlefield. The fight wasn't in that room. The game was already in motion, and I now understood my role. They believed knowledge was something that could be packaged like a product. They forgot knowledge is shaped by failure, late nights, and scars documentation can't translate. When the meeting ended, the young man followed me like a shadow. He didn't know what he represented. He thought he was starting a career. He didn't realize he was walking into the residue of one. As we left the room, HR smiled with the satisfaction of someone who thinks a task has been completed cleanly. They believed they were replacing a position. They had no idea they were provoking an architect. My job wasn't being reviewed. It was already gone, just not in the way they expected. From the first hour, he sat beside me, notebook open and pen trembling with anticipation. I understood exactly what management had done. They had confused enthusiasm with competence. His smile, bright and unburdened, was the smile of someone who believed he was stepping into a role rather than inheriting a world he couldn't yet fathom. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't arrogant. He was simply unaware of the depth he was being asked to swim in. And like many who mistake confidence for capacity, he believed any system could be understood if explained slowly enough. He asked questions, so many questions, but they were the wrong kind. He understood tasks, not reasons. If I showed him how to execute a command, he wrote it down with the precision of someone transcribing a recipe. He never asked why that command triggered that subsystem or what would happen if a dependency changed. He memorized steps without grasping logic. To him, architecture was a set of buttons and sequences. To me, architecture was a living organism, shaped by decisions made to solve real failures he had never experienced. He repeated instructions as though chanting them would grant comprehension. Leadership adored him. They saw eagerness and mistook it for capability. They praised his fresh perspective, telling me how refreshing it was to have young talent hungry to learn. They mistook curiosity for competence, as if the willingness to ask questions was equal to the capacity to understand answers. They applauded his speed, ignoring the fact that speed means nothing when direction is absent. He reminded them of themselves, youthful, cheap, replaceable, and willing to believe the illusion that knowledge can be downloaded like software. Each day, I handed him processes that had taken years of trial and error to refine. He treated them like steps in a dance, one move leading to the next, never noticing the choreography existed to avoid explosions. He recited instructions without recognizing the danger of missing a comma. He proudly demonstrated his ability to perform tasks I guided him through, unaware that it was my presence that made them seem simple. He didn't understand that complexity hides beneath familiarity, and the only reason systems look easy is because someone else absorbed the pain of learning them. At one point, I asked him to explain the logic behind a routine he had just executed. He blinked, smiled, and repeated what he had done word for word. It was like listening to someone describe how to fly a plane based on which buttons they pressed, without grasping lift, drag, altitude, or consequence. That was when I realized he wasn't being trained, he was mimicking. And mimics fail not when instructions run out, but when reality deviates. Management saw none of this. They saw a cheaper salary, a younger face, and a future they believed they could sculpt without cost. They ignored the invisible work, the decisions, instincts, and history embedded in every line of code. They forgot that systems are not just built. They are curated. They evolve alongside the people who understand them. Remove the steward, and the garden becomes a forest of confusion. Replace the gardener with someone who knows only what tools look like, and you inherit weeds. By the third week, he was confident enough to assure leadership he was almost fully on board. They repeated his words as proof of progress, unaware that repetition is not retention. They congratulated themselves for modernizing, proudly believing they were upgrading experience with energy. No one noticed that every answer he gave was built on scaffolding I still held in place. He smiled every day, convinced he was gaining mastery. That smile wasn't malicious. It was innocent. But innocence doesn't protect systems from collapse. His smile didn't know its purpose because he didn't know his task. He thought he was becoming me. He was becoming my absence. And absence doesn't operate systems. It exposes them. The company believed systems were like furniture, objects that could be assembled by following instructions. They assumed that if the documentation existed, the knowledge existed. But documentation, no matter how thorough, is nothing more than a photograph of a moving river. It tells you what something looks like, not how it flows, and certainly not why it bends the way it does. They never grasped this distinction because they never had to stand in the water. Behind every dashboard they admired and every button they clicked lived logic woven from thousands of decisions made under pressure. There were no accidents in my code. Every module was shaped by a night spent solving a crisis no one else was awake to see. Every alert was born from a mistake made once and never repeated. Those systems weren't the result of planning meetings, they were the result of scars. And scars don't translate well into bullet points. When the executives demanded documentation years earlier, I gave them what they wanted, a list of functions, commands, and usage instructions. They never asked for the real architecture. The if-then stories, the buried fail-safes, the emergency pathways, the conditions that differentiated success from catastrophe. They thought code was literal. They didn't understand that code becomes metaphor once it starts interacting with reality. A line may look simple, but simplicity often hides the choice not to collapse. The young man replacing me printed my documents and highlighted them like exam material. He read each line with the confidence of someone who believes textbooks build bridges. He didn't realize that the code base wasn't just syntax, it was a living organism. It had grown organically over 17 years, shaped by vendor demands, regulatory changes, and internal politics. Entire sections existed not because logic required them, but because a senior manager once made a decision that had to be quietly corrected without bruising ego. Documentation never mentions politics. Code always remembers it. He once asked why a function checked for a value that no longer existed. I told him the story. 3 CFOs ago, a vendor changed their invoice format without notice. The system nearly collapsed. I built a check to detect their mistakes before finance did. The vendor eventually cleaned up their mess, but the check remained. It was no longer necessary, but it was still essential. He blinked, confused, and asked why it wasn't written in the documentation. I smiled. How do you document a scar? Executives assumed documentation equaled mastery. They didn't understand that mastery isn't the act of knowing what each part does. Mastery is the ability to predict how every part behaves when something unexpected happens. Documentation tells you where the walls are. Mastery tells you which walls carry the weight of the roof. Remove the wrong one, and everything collapses, even if your notes say the building should stand. There were routines I wrote at 3 a.m. during a payroll outage no one remembers. There were flags buried in code to prevent fraud attempts the finance team never discovered. There were scripts that behaved differently when they detected unusual user patterns during end-of-quarter surges. These were not features, they were instincts translated into logic. They came from experience, not manuals. You cannot annotate instinct. The irony was poetic. The company had all the ingredients of knowledge, but none of the recipe. They possessed the code, but not the reasoning. They held the maps, but not the compass. They fired the navigator, assuming the ship would keep sailing out of habit. But systems don't move because they are documented. They move because someone understands what should never be written down. The executives thought they owned my work. What they never understood was this: owning code isn't knowing code, and knowing code isn't understanding it. The email arrived at precisely 9:03 a.m., as if punctuality could soften the blow. The subject line read, Transition Completion Timeline. The body contained bullet points, bolded dates, and a tone so casual it felt insulting. HR didn't ask whether 6 weeks was feasible. They informed me it was. No discussion. No negotiation. No acknowledgement of nearly 2 decades of service. According to their schedule, 17 years of architecture, crisis resolution, and institutional memory could be transferred like a customer support ticket between shifts. They called it a knowledge transfer period, a phrase that suggested knowledge could be scooped, boxed, and shipped. What they didn't understand was unsettlingly simple. Knowledge isn't content. It's context. And context takes time to live, not time to list. But HR wasn't interested in understanding. Their department lived in a world made of policies, not consequences. In their minds, loyalty was an ingredient like toner or furniture, replaceable and replenishable when required. The order included daily checklists of what I was expected to teach my replacement: system architecture review, critical scripts, warehouse integration logic, vendor workflows, payroll contingency paths. The scope was so absurdly packed that even a team of seasoned engineers would have struggled to absorb it, let alone someone whose technical experience was defined by enthusiasm and a brand new badge. The arrogance wasn't in the demand itself, it was in the belief that I would comply without question. There was no transition bonus. Nothing to reflect the gravity of the request. No gesture to soften the humiliation of training the person who would take my chair before it cooled. It wasn't a handover, it was extraction. They treated me like a pipeline they could drain until nothing remained. They didn't notice that pipelines sometimes contain pressure valves. My supervisor approached me later that week, script in hand, voice rehearsed, thanking me for my professionalism during this important phase. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never worked a night resolving an outage that could bankrupt a client. He praised my calm demeanor as though calm was consent. It wasn't. It was calculation. I wasn't angry. Anger burns fast. Strategy endures. As the weeks unfolded, I observed senior leadership celebrating their decision, congratulating themselves for reducing legacy overhead. They spoke the language of savings without understanding cost. CTO memos mentioned fresh energy and modern perspectives, implying that the past could be discarded without consequence. They forgot the past was the only reason the present existed. They treated my expertise as if it were a couch, one that could be reupholstered, repurposed, or moved without damaging the frame. The young man assigned to replace me sensed none of this. He smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who believes the road ahead has been paved. He never noticed the cracks he would eventually trip on. He recorded procedures, diagrammed workflows, and nodded enthusiastically at explanations he didn't yet understand. He thought the deadline was a challenge. Management thought it was efficiency. Only I knew it was a countdown. By week 4, leadership began asking for confirmation reports, progress snapshots proving transition success. They wanted assurance. They wanted signatures. They wanted evidence that the torch had been passed. They didn't realize that torches can burn when held incorrectly. What made the situation surreal wasn't the betrayal. Betrayals are common. It was the certainty with which they assumed mastery could be transferred like software. They forgot systems don't run on code alone. They run on the memory of the person who knows where failure hides. HR believed they were packing knowledge. What they were packing was a trap built from their own arrogance. They didn't seal my fate with that order. They sealed theirs. By the time my final week arrived, the office had transformed into something resembling a farewell parade staged on autopilot. People who hadn't spoken to me in months suddenly appeared at my doorstep, offering half-hearted compliments wrapped in thinly veiled relief. They weren't thanking me for 17 years of infrastructure. They were thanking me for leaving quietly. The executives believed transitions were measured in smiles and handshakes, not in the stability of the systems that define their revenue. My replacement, still convinced he was ascending to greatness, hovered outside my office every morning with a notebook full of hopes and empty pages. He wanted scripts. Not understanding. Not architecture. Scripts, step-by-step procedures he could recite like a chant. And I gave them to him. Every line he asked for, every command he demanded, I delivered with the calm of someone settling unfinished accounts. He mistook my composure for acceptance. He didn't realize calm often signals inevitability. On Wednesday of that week, the company organized a small celebration in the break room. Paper plates, lukewarm coffee, and a cake with my name misspelled, as though attention to detail were optional in every department. They clapped. They applauded my contributions, using words carefully chosen so no one accidentally acknowledged the truth. They hadn't appreciated those contributions until they needed to replace them. The CTO delivered a speech about legacy foundations and new directions, the kind of empty rhetoric that dissolves upon contact with reality. My replacement stood beside me, beaming like a knight freshly knighted by a king too distracted to realize he handed over the kingdom without the map. He still clutched the scripts I had given him, pages dense with instructions he believed represented mastery. He didn't understand that code is not knowledge. Code is a language, and languages become dangerous when spoken without comprehension. That afternoon, I performed what everyone assumed was my final contribution, a cleanup operation. System maintenance. Version control updates. Permissions consolidation. It looked routine. It was routine until the last subtle addition. I integrated a single line of dormant code, tucked away like a seed beneath soil. It was harmless unless mishandled. It slept quietly, waiting for a moment that was inevitable, the moment someone pretended to know more than they actually did. The line wasn't malicious. It wasn't sabotage. It was a consequence, an automated guardian triggered only when someone initiated a high-level process without verifying dependencies. An experienced architect would have recognized its purpose instantly. Someone who understood the system would have known to disable it before attempting certain operations. Someone who had spent nights fixing payroll breakdowns during holiday cutoffs would have known exactly what not to touch. My replacement didn't possess that history. On Friday afternoon, my final day, leadership gathered once more. They shook my hand, smiled proudly, and posed for photographs that made them look visionary rather than blind. They believed transitions were ceremonial moments, documented and archived like trophies. They thought they had extracted everything they needed. They never imagined the most valuable knowledge wasn't extractable. As I walked out of the building, I passed the server room one last time. Rows of machines hummed, unaware of the arrogance accumulating beyond their walls. They didn't know they were waiting for a misplaced keystroke, a misinterpreted instruction, or an overconfident assumption. They simply waited, patient as gravity. By the end of the day, everyone believed the crown had been passed. They thought the kingdom was secure. They mistook possession for control. They mistook instructions for experience. They mistook imitation for inheritance. They celebrated a transfer they believed was complete. What they didn't understand was that knowledge isn't handed over. It reveals itself only to those who earned it. And hidden in the code they applauded lay a final lesson, one they were already too late to avoid. The trouble began quietly. The way storms do before lightning reminds the sky of its purpose. 2 days after my departure, the system initiated a routine process, a scheduled task embedded deep within the architecture. It wasn't a dramatic event. It didn't trigger alarms. It simply did what it had done every month for more than a decade: verify authentication and revalidate access to core modules. Except this time, the one person who understood why it asked those questions was no longer there. My replacement sat at his desk, sipping an overconfident cup of coffee, unaware that he was seconds away from becoming a historical footnote. When the prompt appeared, he didn't flinch. It requested credentials, system tokens, and a sequence that only made sense to someone who understood its origin. He had the scripts I gave him. He had the authority he believed he inherited. What he didn't have was comprehension. He entered commands like a man reciting incantations in a language he didn't speak. The system watched him with perfect neutrality. Machines don't judge, they calculate. And when calculations detect anomalies, they act. My line of dormant code, placed years ago and untouched since, wasn't malicious, it was protective. It was a safeguard built after a subcontractor nearly compromised vendor access. It wasn't designed to break systems. It was designed to erase compromised pathways before they could be exploited. When he entered the wrong authentication sequence, he didn't fail the system. He instructed it. The servers didn't crash. That would imply malfunction. They executed. Entire sections of the architecture initiated purge protocols, clearing data pathways, locking modules, and erasing cached dependencies no longer trusted. The logs reported compliance, not chaos. Every deletion was documented. Every triggered module confirmed intent. To the system, it was obedience. To leadership, it looked like annihilation. At first, no one understood what was happening. Warehouse dashboards blinked offline. Vendor confirmations returned empty fields. Payroll queries produced error messages that looked like riddles. The finance department assumed a temporary glitch. Operations rebooted terminals. Managers told staff to remain calm. They believed minor disruptions were beneath panic. Then the second wave hit. Batch jobs refused to execute. Inventory synchronization reverted to factory defaults. Access levels dissolved, returning authorized users to guest permissions. Someone tried to override the locks. The system responded by escalating the purge. It wasn't punishing them. It was following logic. If authentication fails at the root, the tree must be cleared. Confusion turned to fear when they attempted to restore backups and discovered those, too, required a secondary access chain, one that resided in my memory, not their servers. Their disaster recovery plan assumed the world they understood still existed. It didn't. They had replaced the pilot and assumed the aircraft could fly itself. Meetings erupted across the building. Executives demanded explanations. Engineers stuttered through technical jargon that sounded like apologies dressed in complexity. My replacement, now pale and sweating, insisted he followed the scripts exactly. He was telling the truth, but truth doesn't protect you when you don't understand the consequences of execution. The CTO attempted to contact me. He left frantic voicemails filled with phrases like unexpected cascade and urgent support. It was the same tone a person uses when they realize the breaks were decorative. By the time they reached out, the purge had completed its task. The system didn't break. It reset to a state that required the one ingredient they had confidently discarded: understanding. Screens across departments displayed the same message, not in red, not in flashing lights, pure, calm text: authentication required. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was asking a question. The company had fired the only person who knew the answer. And systems, unlike people, do not accept improvisation. The first sign of collapse didn't come from the boardroom or the servers, it came from the floor. Warehouse supervisors reported that pallets scheduled for shipment had no destinations. Tracking numbers existed, but their associated data had vanished as if someone had swept the system clean of intention. Forklifts sat idle while workers stared at screens that once told them exactly what to move, where it belonged, and when it was expected. Without those instructions, the warehouse wasn't a distribution center. It was a labyrinth. Then the phone calls started. Orders from long-standing clients didn't just fail, they disappeared. Purchase histories blinked into oblivion, leaving sales teams unable to confirm what had been promised or delivered. Customers thought the silence was arrogance. They didn't realize it was paralysis. The failure spread faster than leadership could draft a response. Each hour without clarity birthed a new rumor, a new accusation, a new crisis. Vendor contracts followed. Automated payment schedules now produced blanks where invoice confirmations should have been. Some vendors assumed fraud and halted shipments. Others demanded emergency calls to confirm balances and delivery commitments. Relationships that took years to build fractured in minutes. Without system traces, logistics became fiction. The vendors didn't care about internal turmoil. Business runs on results, not excuses. Finance was next. Payroll queries generated errors that threatened to delay salaries. The accounting team tried to run reconciliations, only to discover that half the financial routes led to dead ends. When they attempted manual overrides, the system denied access. The purge hadn't been sloppy. It had been absolute, leaving behind only the architecture of a world leadership didn't understand. Auditors arrived uninvited. They came armed with regulatory authority, not curiosity. When they asked for logs proving system ownership and access control, leadership presented documents that looked complete until auditors traced signatures. Every critical authorization converged on one name: mine. Each signature authenticated a point in history the company no longer possessed. My replacement's name appeared nowhere. To the auditors, this wasn't a technical glitch. It was a governance failure. The board demanded answers. Executives blamed consultants, upgrades, external threats, anything except the truth. But machines are impartial archivists. They record actions without emotion. The logs revealed no external breach, no network intrusion. They showed exactly what had happened. An unauthorized user executed high-level scripts without proper authentication. The system followed protocol. Leadership had not. Whispers circulated in hallways. Employees wondered why someone so critical had been dismissed without fanfare. Some recalled overhearing executives boast about trimming fat. Others remembered the optimism that followed my replacement's hiring. None spoke loudly, but silence carries judgment. They knew the company had gambled with its lifeline and lost. My replacement, once hailed as the next phase of innovation, sat in conference rooms with the expression of a man discovering that knowledge is not transferable by proximity. He insisted he had followed instructions. He was right. He had done everything he was told. What he didn't know is that instructions are only useful when backed by understanding. Leadership mistook obedience for capability. Legal departments scrambled to craft statements that sounded reassuring without admitting liability. They attempted to frame the collapse as an unexpected systems malfunction. But clients and partners didn't accept uncertainty. They demanded guarantees the company could no longer provide. A business that cannot prove operational integrity becomes a business without worth. Leadership's final attempt at control was a frantic search for someone to blame. They sifted through logs like detectives searching for fingerprints on broken glass. And they found them everywhere. Not malicious traces. Just the truth, mine. The system didn't collapse because of sabotage. It collapsed because they replaced competence with enthusiasm. Because they believed cost was more important than continuity. Because they forgot the oldest rule in engineering: cheap doesn't scale. It breaks. Justice rarely announces itself with fanfare. It doesn't always arrive with courtrooms, headlines, or confessions. Sometimes, justice appears quietly in the form of consequences no one can outrun. In my case, it came disguised as opportunity. The company that once believed I was a disposable cog became the loudest reference in my portfolio, not because they praised me, but because they demonstrated what happened without me. Today, my consultancy operates on a different set of values. I choose clients carefully. I don't chase contracts, they chase clarity. Corporations invite me into boardrooms not to modernize software, but to prevent leadership from making the kind of mistake that nearly erased their predecessors. They listen not because they fear me, but because they fear the arrogance that once blinded them. Respect, it turns out, is far cheaper than recovery. My invoices aren't debated. They're processed ahead of payroll. Executives don't question the cost because they finally understand that replacing mastery is more expensive than retaining it. They treat knowledge like capital, not clutter. I host workshops explaining the difference between instructions and insight, between ownership and comprehension. Some take notes reverently. Others stare at me with the haunted expression of someone who recognizes a past mistake too late to undo it. Meanwhile, the company that fired me exists as a cautionary tale whispered in industry circles. Their headquarters, once a maze of ambition, now echoes with delay notices, restructuring memos, and surrender disguised as strategy. The merger that was supposed to redefine their future became a milestone marking their undoing. Investors vanished. Vendors tightened terms. Employees who once planned careers there now list the experience on their resumes like a scar, proof of survival, not pride. My replacement didn't last 3 weeks. He resigned abruptly, leaving behind a 3-sentence email that read more like superstition than resignation. He claimed the system was cursed as though code could possess malice. But machines don't hate. They don't punish. They don't retaliate. They simply demand answers. And he never had any. When the system presented questions only experience could answer, he treated them like riddles. The system didn't break under his touch, it revealed the absence of understanding. Leadership tried to hire consultants to repair what they had broken. Firms declined. Not out of fear, but out of recognition, no one wants to rebuild a structure whose foundation was removed by ego. Eventually, they attempted to reconstruct the system from fragments of backups they didn't understand. Every attempt led to another dead end. Their problem wasn't technological. It was philosophical. They believed expertise was interchangeable. They confused documentation with architecture. And architecture refuses to cooperate when stewardship is absent. Years later, the board still debates what went wrong. They blame timing, market shifts, and legacy design. They avoid the simplest explanation. They thought loyalty could be extracted without cost. They believed experience was dust. They imagined systems were obedient servants rather than mirrors reflecting leadership's blind spots. They fired me because they saw a salary. They collapsed because they never saw the value. My former CEO, once proud enough to dismiss me without hesitation, now speaks at minor leadership seminars about respecting institutional knowledge. He uses phrases like lessons learned and strategic alignment. He never mentions my name, but everyone knows the ghost he's wrestling with. He is not haunted by me. He is haunted by the decision that revealed who he really was. People ask me if I regret walking away. I don't. I didn't walk away. I was pushed out of a house whose walls I built. They believed the eviction was triumph. They didn't understand that sometimes foundations are the ones holding up the roof. They thought they were teaching me humility. They didn't realize systems don't care about emotions. Systems remember builders. And when arrogance tries to rewrite history, architecture writes the final chapter.